I'm Venetia Rainey.
And I'm Arthur Scott Geddes.
And this is Battle Lines Global Health Security. It's Wednesday, 3rd of December, 2025.
This week, we're looking at the security crisis in northern Nigeria. We've had mass abduction of school children, the activities of extremist groups are increasing, Donald Trump is threatening to send in the troops guns a-blazing, and now it seems as though there's a famine looming.
What's driving all of this? Who are the groups behind it, and what do they want? We're going to be speaking to someone on the ground from the World Food Programme to find out, and our reporter from the Telegraph, Lilia Sebouai, who went to Nigeria last year. We're joined now by Chi Lael, Head of Communications for the World Food Programme in Nigeria. Chi, thank you so much for joining us on Battle Lines Global Health Security. I just want to get a sense of the mood on the ground. Hundreds of children and women have been kidnapped, a state of emergency has been declared by the president, and Trump is threatening to militarily intervene. What are you seeing and hearing on the ground there?
The past few weeks have been quite intense. We've seen school children being kidnapped in the middle of the night. We've seen churchgoers being attacked and kidnapped. Even the military have been attacked and killed. It means that for people who were doing ordinary things, trying to forge normal lives, they're totally disrupted and they're living in fear. The things that we take for granted, such as sending our children to school or just going to work, have been totally upended because nobody knows when the next attack will hit. And so I think the biggest concern right now is that the number of attacks have increased at such a pace that it really is driving food insecurity, but also regional instability across northern Nigeria into the neighbouring countries in the Sahel.
What's driving the growing pace of these attacks that you describe? What are the factors at play here?
So most recently, we saw that an Al-Qaeda affiliate from Mali claimed its first attack in northern Nigeria. We have seen a number of faction groups growing in size, but also Boko Haram, that has been in northeast Nigeria for over a decade, really grow and expand its territory. And so all of these groups, new, emerging, but also long existing insurgent groups, have really been taking a stronger hold over the north, creating instability that is disrupting people's lives. For example, many people think of Nigeria as sort of the Lagos bubble that they see on television, but actually 70% of the population are farmers. They work in agriculture, and much of the food that Nigeria grows is in these northern regions. But as we've also seen, most of these attacks are also in those regions. And so they are directly attacking not only people, but Nigeria's source of food, people's incomes, and people's abilities to form communities and have peaceful lives.
And what is it that's driving these mass kidnappings in particular? Is it just a kind of, is it the ransoms, or is there something else at play?
Honestly, it hasn't been identified or hasn't been disclosed exactly what it is that is being sought after. What we know is that the number of attacks that we are seeing this year are far more than they were last year. So if I take an example, this time last year, we traveled to northwest Nigeria, and we traveled to many of the locations that are in headline news today. Number one, we would never be allowed to do those missions again on our own. It would require heavy military escorts. I haven't been to northeast Nigeria as much as I had this time last year. But also what we saw last year is that people were resorting by then to very negative and dangerous coping mechanisms in order to survive. These people who, faced with the loss of their farms, they have often forced to give up their farmlands or to sell them, or they just run away from them in fear, were doing things that we would never expect traditional northern cultural people to do. So we spent an evening with survival sex workers, and these were mothers who, through no fault of their own, simply had to go and do some of the most dangerous work in order to feed their children every single day. And it surprised me that there was no shame, there were no repercussions, because it was necessary work in order to survive. And so in here on, when you see that the number of attacks have spiraled way more than they were last year, you can only imagine what people are going through, but also what they're having to do in order to keep themselves safe and to keep themselves fed. And so I think the biggest worry is that if this continues, if this is just the beginning of a wave of attacks and a spiraling insecurity, where will it leave people in northern Nigeria? How are they going to cope? Already we've seen that international funding has considerably depreciated, and it has left the UN and the humanitarian community's ability to respond really at the bare minimum. I think what's really worrying is that we don't know where this is going. Something quite dramatic has begun. And if this continues, our means of responding, Nigerians' means of surviving, it's really quite scary.
There's lots to unpack there. Thank you, Chi. We hear a lot about the school children being kidnapped, and those have really been generating headlines, more than 300 recently, which surpassed the awful previous record of more than 250 by Boko Haram from that school in Chibok back in 2014. I know all of our listeners will remember the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. But you talked about farmers there. Is that the sort of hidden crisis that's happening on a wider scale, but with smaller numbers?
Definitely. If we just take northeast Nigeria, just the sort of pocket of the country where we work, we record at least 3 attacks each day. Many of them are deadly. Almost all of them involve farmers. And so in villages, in communities, people who are just trying to go out to do honest work can't even get to their farms to find food for themselves, because there's a very real risk that they'll be attacked. They will be killed, they will be kidnapped, and they may not return. And so when we talk about the attacks, they're not just for school children, or they're not just in northwest Nigeria. They're actually happening across the country, and they're happening every day. Just as you mentioned, they may not be 300 children at a time, but certainly 10, 15, 20 at a time are being kidnapped. And even most recently, we saw that after an attack, 20,000 people left their village by foot because they just couldn't bear to be there in case the insurgents returned. And so you're seeing mass migration across Nigeria, but also into the neighboring countries. When people are afraid, when people don't know what's about to attack them next, they don't stay where they are, they move.
I just want to play a clip now that Donald Trump put out on his Truth Social account recently, in which he threatens to send the US military into Nigeria in response to these attacks.
If the Nigerian government continues to allow the killing of Christians, the USA will immediately stop all aid and assistance to Nigeria. We're going to do things to Nigeria that Nigeria is not going to be happy about, and may very well go into that now disgraced country, guns are blazing, to completely wipe out the Islamic terrorists who are committing these horrible, horrible atrocities. I'm hereby instructing our Department of War to prepare for possible action. If we attack, it will be fast, vicious, and sweet, just like the terrorist thugs attack our cherished Christians. These are cherished people. These are great people. Leave them alone. Warning, the Nigerian government better move fast before it's too late. If they don't, there's going to be hell to pay.
So this message frames what's going on as a kind of pogrom against Christians. And this message has been endorsed by a number of people, perhaps the most surprising being Nicki Minaj. Is there any truth to this, though?
Honestly, what we have seen is that everybody is being attacked. There is no separation when attacks happen at nighttime in villages, on communities. It's people, it's families that are attacked en masse. And so we've seen that all groups, all ethnicities, everybody is being targeted, and they are all facing the same really horrific consequences of what's going on. I think what we should be aware of is that when these insurgents attack communities, they destroy everything. They burn everything down to the ground. They destroy farmlands, they destroy schools, they destroy places of work. Everybody in a community of every ethnicity, of every type of faith group uses those services, uses those schools, goes to those shops. And so entire communities are being impacted every time an attack occurs.
This sounds more like a civil war with whole communities being razed to the ground. How is the government responding? We know they've recruited or are trying to recruit another 20,000 soldiers or policemen to try and deal with the issue, and they've brought down people's VIP protection to try and sort of redistribute security officials to deal with it. Is that enough? What else do they need to be doing?
I think the biggest thing they need to do is to start addressing the humanitarian crisis. A few months ago, one of the governors in the north warned that young people were being recruited into insurgent groups for as little as 30p, because that's how much it costs to buy food. And so when you think about what it takes to lure young people into really terrible organizations, it probably costs the same amount to provide them with food and the opportunity to go back to school or to learn some sort of work. And so what we really need to see is more targeted action in the solutions that address the crisis, that give people alternative options in life, that give people safe means to access food. If we take the women who are involved in survival sex, if they had an alternative option, they wouldn't do the work they're doing. If young men, often men, had alternative means of buying food or eating for the day, they probably would take those safer options that give them a better chance at life. And so we need the government to really support the humanitarian response. People need food, people need shelter, and a whole host of other things, so that when there are these negative forces that are so many and so strong there is a buffer, there is an option B, there isn't a safe passage for people to choose and take. We don't want people running into forests or into unsafe zones because they think at least I'll be fed. We want them to know that they can find humanitarian food assistance, they can find support from the government to help them when these attacks occur.
We're in a position now where the West African Hunger Monitor is predicting famine-like conditions next year. Is there anything that can be done to stop that from playing out?
Two things that are really important. Right now, people need to eat. So that analysis that you mentioned, it measures how hungry people are today and next week, in the next few months. And it's warning that 35 million people will need food assistance for immediate survival. It means that however they were coping before, they can't cope like that anymore. If they were working, it means they've lost their jobs, or their jobs are so low paid they can't buy food. It means that if they were farmers, they can't access their farms. And so really what needs to happen, particularly for the north of the country, is that people need either support to buy food or to access food today. It will stop them starving tomorrow, but also the security element. It's really important that the security issue is addressed, because that's the only way to get people back home. If people are back home, they can grow the food they need to eat themselves, but also those people are very much responsible for growing the food for the entire country. So if the North doesn't grow food, Nigeria doesn't have any food, and then it will have to import all the food that it needs to feed 230 odd million people, it's going to be too much. And so really, food assistance is the first part. It is what is going to keep children alive. It is what will keep adults, elderly people, everybody eating today, stop them from going into the arms of negative groups, but also the longer term thinking about providing solutions, making sure that we have peace on the ground. We don't provide the peace. We need the government to ensure that there's peace, so that people can go back to their homes, can start businesses, can go back into areas of work. That's what's most needed right now.
You mentioned negative groups several times, and I wonder if you could just elaborate a bit on who these groups are and whether they are all organised groups. You mentioned Boko Haram, but there are other Islamist groups. And are there also just criminal gangs?
Yes, I think one of the hardest parts of the recent spate of attacks is that not all of these attacks have been identified or claimed. And so where you can name certain groups, other times you don't know if it is an opportunist or if it's criminal gangs or bandits is what we call them in Nigeria, because they're looting, they're burning buildings down, they're destroying people's homes, they are kidnapping people and then returning the people. And so actually we use the term insurgency, but actually it's more like a form of terrorizing people. It's aggression, it's scaring people, it's terrifying communities, because there's no pattern and there's no sort of knowledge or understanding of what's happening. It feels sporadic. It feels like a huge shock factor every time it happens. Like, I can't even imagine how those school kids felt at 2 a.m. being taken out of their school while they were sleeping. They were children. And that's the nature of those attacks. They're vicious because of the nature of them. They come in the middle of the night. They come with fire and with guns. But also they're becoming increasingly more sophisticated. And that's particularly the case of Boko Haram. Now they're using drones. So if we want to do our normal work and show the area that we're working, we can't, because the military can't tell the difference between one of our drones and a drone that could be used by Boko Haram or an insurgent group. And so the methods that they're using to strike are becoming more sophisticated. The weapons that they're using are also becoming more sophisticated. And so everything is really sort of tangled and much more complex this year than compared to last year.
What's driving these groups to become more sophisticated, and where are they getting these weapons from?
It's a good question, but the truth is that it hasn't been made clear where they're getting this support from. Certainly, these groups move across regions. We have the Sahel in northern Nigeria, which is Nigeria, Niger, Chad. If you trace the Sahel trade route, it takes you all the way up to Sudan and the north of Africa. And so actually, there are interlinking organizations. Like I mentioned earlier, there's the Al-Qaeda affiliated group, which entered Nigeria from Mali, but has links back to the Middle East. And so working out how they are all interconnected is, to be honest, beyond me and what I do. But we are very aware that the web of insurgencies and how they are all fighting against Nigerians, but against each other, is far more than we've seen in recent years.
Has Trump's intervention, and I know you said not from what you see as it's not a genocide of Christians from what you can see, and I think that's widely backed up by sort of reporting around the issue, but what impact have his comments had on the situation in Nigeria?
His comments typically have a way of spotlighting events that would have otherwise gone unnoticed and unfairly unseen. And what it has done is reminded the world that this is happening, and it is not a one-off. This is the everyday lived experiences of people in the north. They are being attacked every day. They are being forced to flee every day. They are losing their family members as they're fleeing every day. And so what his comments have done and what his recent actions have done has reminded the world that what's happening in northeast Nigeria could also be happening in other places, but also the risk that it poses to stability in West Africa is huge. Nigeria is often described as the linchpin for the region. So if Nigeria goes, the fear is what happens to the neighboring countries that depend on its political stability, its economic stability, and also its security. The other countries in recent years have faced coups, Niger, Chad. They're now being ruled by the military. Nigeria is one of the remaining democracies in the Sahel region, and probably or arguably the most important one. And so if that is attacked or if that is under threat, it puts West Africa as a region into real jeopardy.
Is there a risk of Nigeria going, as you put it?
It's hard to tell. Nigeria is always described as too big to fail, but some parts of it are really lagging. And you don't imagine that in 2025, school children will still be kidnapped in the middle of the night. But then it happens. And then it happens again in the same week. You don't imagine that a country with its economy will have 35 million people unable to feed themselves. But then you see it, and it's true, and the numbers are rising. All these things that you don't imagine, you end up seeing. And so we really hope it doesn't fail. And I think everybody will do everything that it can. I believe the government will do everything it can not to fail. But all these areas that it is lagging in pulls the country down from being where it should be or for achieving the potential that it has the capacity to reach.
How are Nigerians looking at these comments coming from Donald Trump? You know, the threat to send in the military, guns are blazing. Is there a sense in which an intervention, would be welcomed in some way to try and resolve this crisis?
230 million people. The views are so varied. I don't know if anyone really believes it. I think everybody is sort of waiting to see what happens next, waiting to see if the government efforts sort of step up and reach the needs that are in the north, the needs that are across the country. And I think people want the government to do something. There's a general feeling of how long will this continue for? how long will we continue to wake up and be surprised by something that's happened again? Or when will the kidnapping of children stop? Because Chibok was more than 10 years ago, but here we are again in 2025. I think there's a real fatigue, or just a real sort of angst that this has gone on for far too long. Insecurity has gone on for far too long. And just the destabilization has gone on for much longer than anybody would have ever anticipated or imagined.
We touched on it briefly earlier, but I think it's worth exploring in more detail. What impacts are the kind of global aid cuts having on this situation in northern Nigeria?
So in July, we were very honest and admitted that if we didn't receive any money in July, we were going to have to shut down our programs. And WFP is the largest provider of humanitarian food aid in the country. So if we shut down, millions of people would be out of access of the food they need to survive each day. That included children who receive services in clinics. It included also the mothers who receive nutrition services. But it wasn't just a US issue. We had noticed months before that there was a general decline in the funding that we had received. It's understandable given everything that is happening in the world, but also at the same time very worrying, because it meant that the people who needed help the most were being forgotten, or they were being sidelined. And we faced the risk of letting down a lot of people who had no other means of surviving except for us. In that time, we raised some money. Money came from the US, notably. And that meant that we could continue until December this year. And so we're now in this quite difficult cycle of receiving money in piecemeal, which allows us to do some things for a few months. And then we get to the end of those few months and we don't know what's going to happen next. It's tough for us, but it is unimaginable what it will mean for people that we serve if we can't provide them with the food. Food aid is and continues to be the means that which people survive. It's literally life or death. If people don't eat, they will starve. And if we can't get the food to them, there's nothing else. There's no one else that is providing the assistance at the scale that we do it. We are trying really hard to do this with the government, to teach them, to pass on the skills so that they can take this on and they can cover a larger sort of caseload, support more people. But right now it's WFP, and we are seeing that the funding situation just isn't keeping pace with the needs.
Where do you see this going next? The situation sounds really severe. Have there been any protests against the government? Is there any sense that anyone needs to resign?
No. If this was in the UK, there would be calls for resignations. There would be protests. But in this climate, things are very different. And to be very honest with you, protesting means that somebody who earns a daily wage didn't go to work. And if they didn't go to work, they don't eat. The luxury of protesting, it doesn't exist. It's not the same culture. People every day make the choice that they will go and do jobs they don't like, very physically exhausting work, or begging on the streets, or survival sex in order to eat. And so the people who probably would protest aren't the first people to be affected, because those people are still buying food, they're driving cars, they're going to work, they are sending their children to school. The people who are really the poorest in society, they can't afford to lose that day's wage. It's just not an option for them.
So what next? How do you see this developing?
My biggest concern is that the situation will continue, that the attacks will grow in size and the frequency or the number of them, because they can, and because they've seen the impact they've had over the last few weeks. My worry is that they will be emboldened, that they will move from the northern region down into the areas in the middle belt and in the south of the country. And soon this will become something that we're not able to control. My hope is that there'll be a real transformation next year of will to contain the instability where it is, to combat the growing threat of insurgent groups, but also to provide the assistance that people need to secure farmlands, to secure communities, to, like you said, put the police on the streets in the places where they need to be policing, to be making areas safe. It's that, or I don't know, something much bleaker. So I'm hoping for the best. I'm hoping that we get the funding that we need to provide food assistance. I'm hoping that the government sends a whole lot of its funding and support and will into the north to address the humanitarian needs, to address the development needs, and that everybody realizes that there is a collective responsibility to stabilize the north of Nigeria because of its position in the region, because of what it means to stability across the other Sahel countries, that it is not worth risking, and the fallout would be too big for the entire region should it go the other way.
Chi Lael, Head of Communications for the World Food Programme in Nigeria, thank you very much for joining us on Battle Line's Global Health Security.
We're joined now by Lilia Sebouai, one of the reporters from the Telegraph's Global Health Security Desk, who visited Nigeria last year.
Lilia Sebouai, welcome to Battle Line's Global Health Security. You went to Nigeria last year. Where did you go and what did you see?
So we went to the northwest. We went to Katsina State, Kano State, and Zamfara, and we saw the record levels of hunger there. What we saw when we were there is we visited lots of farmers, and every day the bandits would come and they'd wait until the harvest was due, and then they'd say, if you want access to your harvest, you have to pay us these taxes. And then when they refused, they'd kidnap people, they'd drag them into the forest, hold them for ransom, and the entire community would have to pitch in to get enough money to even try to bring people home. And because of this, because the farmers aren't able to harvest their food, that's disrupting the supply chains and food supply, and that's trickling all the way down to massive booming megacities like Lagos and Abuja. The thing that I found really pronounced is it wasn't just kind of the levels of hunger you'd expect to see in a displacement camp. What's really evident is the really deep levels of poverty. So it didn't feel like it was a short-term crisis. It was a deeply, deeply rooted crisis that's been going on for decades and decades. And it wasn't a thing that UN funding was just going to be able to fix. It needed deep structural change from the government to pull these people out of these depressing situations. Like we met lots of women that have resorted to prostitution as a means to survive and feed their children. And it's also a very strict Muslim environment in the north as well. So it's completely against the grain and very dangerous and risky for them. But that was the extent people had been driven to.
And you also spoke to people, or you met people who were trying to plug the security gap, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's a huge access problem for the Nigerian authorities. Tell us a bit about that.
So we met these groups of vigilantes in the northwest, these young boys that were barely adults, and they were stepping up to help their communities because the military and government weren't able to get it under control. So they'd have these tiny makeshift guns. And I asked one of them, how often do they come? And they said they come every day. And we met one of the local leaders. His wife and daughter had been kidnapped. And the entire community had to pitch in what little pennies they had to get them back.
It's staggering, isn't it? I was reading that more than 100 of those school children who were kidnapped back in 2014 are still missing. Mm-hmm. And it really goes to show the problem, the scale of the problem facing Nigerian authorities and the government in trying to combat it and also to redress these kidnappings when they do happen. We heard that more than 50 children have escaped from that recent kidnapping of more than 300. Escaped or been returned with some kind of negotiations. It's not quite clear. It sounds quite murky. What kind of presence did you see from the Nigerian authorities on the ground when you were there?
It was sparse. It would take us hours to drive across from different states, but it's also very dangerous, and these military vehicles are also targeted by these groups. So we kept having to disrupt our route because we suddenly wouldn't be able to use a road and we'd have to fly to get further up north. There would be like military checkpoints, but it was sparse.
So earlier we spoke to someone from the World Food Programme who was telling us about the hunger crisis in Nigeria. How do you see the situation developing?
It isn't going to get any better until the government puts food security at the forefront of its policy. In its latest annual budget, the current government allocated just 1.7% of spending to agriculture and food security, even though the sector supports 35% of Nigeria's labour force and contributes 22% of its GDP. In June, in response to the food crisis, the government launched a board of nutrition, calling it a war room to battle against malnutrition. But it was unable to lay out who was in it, what it was going to do, how much money they were putting into it. It's just vacuous promise, basically.
A war room to battle against malnutrition. We like the sound of that. Let's hope they staff it with some proper people. Lilia Sebouai, thank you very much for joining us on Battlefine's Global Health Security.
Thank you.
That's all for today's episode. We'll be back next week.
But before we go, just wanted to share a quick bit of feedback that we got from Richard. He said, interesting as always, my problem with the advocates of aid is that they always refuse to address the documented instances where aid has been grossly misspent, and equally where international bodies are clearly ineffective, inefficient and frankly corrupt. He enjoyed the episode on aid in general though. Thank you very much for listening, Richard. We'll be back again next Wednesday. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.